Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Commander's Voice. My guest today, a very special guy, Mr. Nick Jacobellis. He is a former U.S. Customs officer, very unique career in the 70s and 80s, especially the 80s when he was with the Customs Service. And that's what he's here to talk about today. Kind of the term he likes to use is the Miami Vice era of the drug war. Big departure from what we normally do here on the Commander's Voice, but he's a friend of the 82nd. He's a friend of the Signal chapter. And that's how I met him, through some of my airborne buddies. And so we're really happy to have you here today. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here. We've been corresponding, being all the books you've read that you've reviewed for me and some magazine articles, and we became buddies that way. And this is an honor. I'm glad to be here.
Now, this is really exciting. So I'm so glad you mentioned your writing. So everybody, Nick is a published author, several magazine articles, several reviews, but also he's written like 12 books on various aspects of federal law enforcement. Here's a couple of the different ones he's written. He's also written a children's book, which is amazing. So at least 13. I think he's got another one that he's in the mix right now. And what's so cool about Nick's fiction is that it's informed by his background as a federal law enforcement officer. So let's get into a little bit of that background, Nick. Just so everyone's tracking, this is the first in a couple of shows we're going to be doing where we're going to be talking about federal law enforcement. And today we're just going to get Nick's background leading up to some future shows where we're talking about some specific operations he was involved in. So take us back to the beginning, Nick. What was your first cop job?
Actually, I got into this, I think, because when I was a kid, my parents would drag me to church on Sunday with my four brothers. And back then, Mass was packed. And people had a tendency to stand in the aisles, even though there were places to sit. But a lot of people didn't want to sit, in the middle. They wanted to sit at the end. Make a long story short, the back of the church was always filled with New York City cops because there'd be police cars out front or they'd be on a foot post in Flatbush. This was the Flatbush section of Brooklyn. And they'd drop in Mass for a while, obviously Catholics, and leave whenever they had to or had to go on a call. And the priest would usually come off the altar and start yelling at people to sit down. But the only people he never yelled at were the cops. So as a little kid, I'm standing there going like, wow, these guys are special in the eyes of God. That's what I want to do. And I took different tests. And like I said, it took me 8 years to get hired by the Customs Service. It's kind of a fluke that I even got hired. I was working with a cop and he said, that job you told me about in the Customs Service was a Customs Patrol officer. I turned it down. I said, how could you turn it down? You're on the list a year. I'm on the list 8 years because of the freeze during the Carter administration. They weren't hiring federal law enforcement officers. So I went down to World Trade Center and went into personnel. And I had my paperwork with me. And a lady came over, a nice lady, and she said, how can I help you, officer? I was in uniform. And I said, well, see that desk back there, like 4 or 5 rows behind, a big personnel office. I said, I used to sit there every year to renew my certification as a civil service on a civil, so I don't have to take the test again. You had to do it every year. She goes, oh, that desk. Oh, we fired her. But the only person who never get fired in federal service was handling my personnel paperwork. So I got called for an interview, passed, got hired, went to JFK initially, plain clothes, went out to Long Island, worked an undercover operation. But I had worked undercover once before as an investigator in the DA's office in Manhattan. And that's another colorful story when I ended up making this robbery arrest. And in the morning, I'm in uniform, and this guy goes, hey, trooper, where's your horse? And I turn around, and there's this older gentleman, and assistant chief investigator's on his glass of his office. I go inside, he says, sit down. He goes, you want to be a uniformed cop the rest of your life? I said, no, to tell you the truth, sir, I want to be a U.S. Customs agent. He goes, Customs? What do you want to go there for? I said, well, I want to be a federal agent, but it's really like a police department because they got uniformed people, they got canines, they got aircraft and vessels, and I want to travel. I want to get out of New York, and I want to live in different parts of the country. So he takes this black, I knew what it was a commission book, they call them, and he literally tossed it across his desk at me. And I opened it up, and he was a retired U.S. Customs agent. And he said to me, you want to be a detective in the meantime? And I said, sure, why not? He goes, fill this paperwork out. Let me know. I'll be in touch. And I forgot about it. I did it. And 3 months later, I got a call. You start Monday. Hung up the phone. And those were colorful. I mean, the people I worked for in different capacities. A lot of them were World War II vets. They handled things differently. I mean, a lot of them had one guy was torpedoed, other guys were in the Battle of the Bulge, who was in D-Day. And this particular retired customs agent traveled all over the world. He was assigned to the Middle East at one point. He lived in Italy. So they had a perspective on things that was different. And I learned an awful lot from them because they were all can-do people. There was nothing that you could not accomplish. And that, you know, we got the same thing every Sunday as a kid, watching all those black and white World War II movies. And then as a kid, I'm in grammar school and I'm taking cover under my desk when the air raid sirens go off, because now we have a Cold War. And I'm under my desk going like, why am I taking cover if we won World War II? This doesn't compute. And you know, you grow up wanting to be one of the good guys, because that's what we were fed every Saturday, every Sunday. All the movies were geared up where we're the good guys, we're the ones who save the world, and all the cop shows that were starting to come on TV back then. So that's what I grew up wanting to do. And when I finally got to the customs service, that was like, you know, that's the dream come true.
Oh, that's awesome. So how long were you a uniformed statey before you went down to Manhattan DA office?
All total, it was 3 years there, and other outfits. It was probably like 5 all total.
And then, so 5 years with the state cops, then 3 years with the DA's office before you went to customs.
Yeah, all total, it was about 5 years.
Gotcha. Okay.
So it was combined, all total. And then when I got to customs and I stayed in New York, I was there right up to the point that Miami Vice TV show came on.
So was it still the Carter administration when you came on board with customs?
No, actually, it was Reagan got me in. President Reagan changed everything. He stopped the freeze, and that's when everything opened up. These agencies hadn't hired in, like I said, years, except for military personnel who had, if you were in the military, there was a civil service exemption where they were allowed to pick them up. So when Reagan came in and he opened up the floodgates, everybody just started taking people on.
Gotcha. And so once you went with customs, like you said, you started out at JFK International Airport. How many years were you doing customs in New York before you finally got to kind of achieve your dream, as it were, of traveling, getting down to Florida and starting the Miami Vice era?
I started in '83, and I was probably there about I think I got down to Florida about 84 and a half, 85.
So pretty darn quick.
Pretty quick, yeah. I wanted, as soon as whenever Miami Vice came on, I can't remember. As soon as that show came on, that night I saw that episode, I said, that's where we're going. I told my partner, front lines, that's it. And Mexico, obviously, when I was a kid, the reason I picked customs was there was a Life magazine article that did a full blown out issue, big section on the customs service. So here I am taking tests for police department and different outfits, and I see this Life magazine article, and I'm going, "Wow, this outfit's got everything, and I can travel. I can move around the country." And that's when I knew way back then when I was a kid that's what I wanted. That's why it took 8 years to get hired. Besides the freeze, I took the test twice. You're waiting. So anyway, I end up in Miami and get assigned to the Freighter Intelligence Search Team, FIS team, and worked the Miami River. And we did the port and searched freighters, did a lot of surveillance work. Everything was, even though we were patrol officers, it was all basically T-shirts, dungarees, civilian clothes, raid jackets. That's when they started handing out body armor. We're fully equipped.
So when you first got there, was there a sense that folks who are moving narcotics illegally into the country were already well equipped, so they knew you guys needed this gear? Or when you first got there, was it just you and a windbreaker and a revolver being seriously outmatched? Or were you guys equipped the way you needed to be from Jump Street?
No, actually, before I got there, it started to become intense. There's a show called Cocaine Cowboys that kind of goes into this. In fact, we used to go to a bar where they had a shootout. That's another story. It already started, and the money laundering thing was becoming very well known, because that's when people were showing up with valises filled with cash, and the banking industry at the time was just going, okay, thank you, and depositing cash. It was a transitional period. And the federal government we always seemed to be one step behind. So the bad guys would do their thing, we would react. And then once we reacted, we got really good at reacting. And then the bad guys would change tactics. And then we would have to gear back up again and react again. Very similar to the military. And like we talked before, I had friends who were a little older than I was who served in Vietnam, and they went through the same thing. We can have this firefight until we get to that border, but then it's game over. The bad guys get to go across into Cambodia, and we're not allowed to shoot them. We can't go after them. We can't retaliate. And then later on, when the powers to be say, guess what, gear up, we're going into Cambodia, it's okay to do it. We went through the same stuff. It was always driven by events at the time, and then there was this catch up. Let's play catch up. And air operations, by the way, went through that big time. They had very small crews. But when I call it the air war and the Marine war over the Bahamas, when that heated up, they needed bodies. They needed more people. They needed aircraft. They needed more crews. We were launching all the time.
So and you brought up like 3 points that I want to address here. So initially, when you're doing, surveillance, freighter surveillance work in the port, you're, literally, I'm assuming, acting on intelligence you have that there might be illegal activity taking place on specific freighters. And I'm assuming you had to have a warrant or at least probable cause to execute a search, or what was your mandate?
Because we were customs officers and later on customs agents, which were all customs officers by law, our authority was what we call the nexus to the border. So as long as there was the border, and that was the ocean in that case, if a boat came in, we didn't need a warrant to go on board the vessel.
Gotcha.
And that's how the whole concept, why I named the 2 book series, Controlled Delivery, because that, as we'll talk about, later on in another episode, that was a tactic that was used by the Customs Service, that once we intercepted contraband of any kind, as long as we maintained control in some way, shape, or form, we could follow that contraband, escort it, take it, or follow it anywhere in the country. And whoever said that's mine goes to jail.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. So the second point I wanted to bring up is you were talking about you had to deal with, you could only engage up to a certain point. I'm assuming the point was the borders of the country. You've got stuff coming in internationally from different locations, Colombia, for example, during the 80s, especially when we're talking about narcotics. There's obviously a point where if a ship, an aircraft, etc., that you might suspect has illegal cargo, if they're in international waters, there's a point where your authority must have ended and you couldn't do anything about it.
That's a good point that you brought up, because in the early stages, when I became an air officer, I got promoted from a customs patrol officer to air officer. I learned how to fly when I was going through FLETC. I had 5 pilots in my class, and I had mentioned to them, I always wanted to learn how to fly ever since I was a kid. And they said, well, let's go. So I did the whole thing and soloed and learned how to fly a little Cessna 150. That helped me get into air operations. Well, at that time, in the early days, we'd be chasing a smuggling aircraft, and we'd sit there and watch the kicker, who was the person that would jettison the load, stand in the open cargo door, and he'd throw the load out, and they'd be go-fast boats. But we had no authority at that. All we could do is radio Marine units and follow them. And if they went to the Bahamas, the Bahamian police could take them into custody. If they tried to come into the U.S., obviously, then once they crossed customs waters, there was fair game. Well, this went on. So, it was frustrating. You'd be flying next to the bad guy, and they'd bank to the right and go south, and you'd bank to the left and go back to Homestead Air Force Base, and they just dropped a load of dope in the water, and there's not much you can do about it. And sometimes it was pretty far away from the States anyway. And then our bosses actually did really well. Regional counsel and the special agent in charge at the time was passed away. His name is Pat O'Brien. They drafted this federal legislation, and I think it was called 1590, USC 1590. Any contraband introduced anywhere within 250 miles of the United States now became a federal violation of law in the United States.
That's actually fairly generous in terms of a circumference, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. But the good news was in the beginning, when we were chasing drug aircraft, like one time we chased a crew into Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport after they dropped a load outside of along our coastline, but in the Bahamas water, our boats intercepted it. We knew exactly what was going on. We jump out with our weapons, walk up to the pilot, "Hi, you're under arrest." He goes, "For what?" And we say, "Violation of 1590. He goes, "What's that?" I said, "Well, it's a federal violation of law to drop, introduce contraband. You didn't tell us about it." I said, "What do you want to tell you about it? They expected to drop leaflets over like Colombia and Jamaica and all these source countries to like give you a warning that the rules of engagement have changed for once in our favor." So we rode that wave for a bit until the word got out. And then it was still game on, don't get me wrong, but it became a lot more intense. And I think 1 week we saw 5 drug smuggling planes crash and burn.
Wow, that is intense. That's like pretty.
That's I think 1 week there was 5. I saw one ditch, and we rescued the crew with a Coast Guard helicopter, and I saw one cartwheel in and blow up.
Goodness. So you're talking, as you said, a fairly intense time, and I can imagine once word got out, okay, 1590 is a thing now. The bad guys can accelerate their tactics and change what they're doing much more quickly than y'all can get another law passed.
Correct.
So about how long did you guys enjoy a tactical advantage from 1590 before?
Not long. Not long. But it was at that point that other avenues open to them, like cargo smuggling, became a big deal. We had intel about loads that they had what they call the New York Express, which were long-range aircraft that were flying basically from source country where the contraband emanated from, usually at that time, Colombia, and would fly directly to New York, where the radar assets were totally different. That Miami was such a locked in, nailed down tight place that if you flew anything anywhere near in the Bahamas, we got alerted. We had 8 minutes to scramble, and you sat in a ready room, just like a military air crew, kitted up, ready to go. And when that radar operator identified a target, they contacted the command duty officer, for example, at Hope State Air Force Bases where we were co-located. And when that horn went off, you grabbed your kit and you went to the weapons room and grabbed your favorite weapon, your long gun, and you were out on the runway and getting in a Black Hawk, Citation jet, a 404, a Cessna 404, an Aero Commander, and off you went. And you were feet wet within seconds.
Now it's definitely Battle of Britain vibes, but
yeah, wow.
So you went from, as just to backtrack now as we're talking, because this is getting us set up to talk about controlled delivery. You went from customs officer, you were doing patrols in the port, you were doing surveillance of freighters, you got promoted into air operations, and then this is a confluence of things. You get in air operations as things are getting more intense. It sounds like there's decent international cooperation, Bahamian police, U.S. federal government. What was the cooperation like with domestic law enforcement? Whether
Oh, excellent.
Okay.
Yeah, we handed out customs creds to like so many cops and deputy sheriffs. They were deputized as customs officers because they'd pull a car over and there'd be $2 million in the trunk. I mean, they were doing work for us. There was a very big deputization program where buddies of mine who were deputy sheriffs had customs creds, and
that's interesting. I wouldn't have, that's something that it sounds so simple and it makes perfect sense. It wouldn't have occurred to me. I would have thought there had to be liaison and all that kind of stuff. And I'm glad to hear that you guys did the simple, smart thing. That's fantastic.
Yeah, that worked out well. We worked there. I mean, there were times when I didn't have a partner as a customs agent. I was working with deputy sheriffs in Broward County Sheriff's Office. And there were times when buddies of mine were working with Metro-Dade PD in Miami, closer than our own people because we were kind of spread thin, and there was lots of deputy sheriffs and lots of police officers in different departments. And when they were deputized, because they were doing all work anyway.
That actually gives me to tie it back into kind of what we talk about on this podcast, that actually gives me real special forces vibes. You got a 12-man team, right? And but we're gonna get an order of magnitude more effective, because those 12 guys are going to be working with 250, 500 indigenous troops, and we're going to have a much bigger effect than
Right.
12 guys could have alone. Same kind of thing. You've got, for lack of a better term, indigenous law enforcement, Miami-Dade, etc. You give them the proper credentials. They've got one customs guy with them, and now you've got, you're able to cover a lot more. That's textbook foreign internal defense. So
But
that's amazing.
one of the reasons when we talked that I thought that the story control delivery would be interesting to your podcast is because there's tremendous similarities between how we operated it and how the military operated. And back then, the drug war was the only war we had. So the military was looking for missions. And here we came by going like, hey, can I have an AWAC? And how about a Navy surface warfare vessel and a Coast Guard cutter handy and a couple of 1,000 gallons of fuel? And it was, what do you need? We had Marine aviators flying Broncos, OV-10s, flying Marine interdiction missions in the Bahamas, identifying targets. It was game on. It was the mix of and like you say, the deputization of state and locals was almost like a coalition force, where indigenous coalition, however you want to identify it, we were expanded exponentially by all these brothers and sisters in law enforcement who were sworn and trained. And there were times that they had their own Marine patrols. I mean, they had their own boats. They didn't even need us to be on a vessel with them. They were doing customs stops anyway. And there were times I'm in a Black Hawk helicopter, we're flying way out over the ocean, and there's one Florida Marine Patrol cop on a patrol boat, and we're tracking 50, 80 bales of marijuana, big, huge bales, wrapped in burlap and tied up, and we're waiting for a Coast Guard cutter or someone to come by and scoop it up, and he's out there by himself.
That's absolutely amazing.
It's an amazing sight to see too, by the way, 50, 75, 80, because they drop off by a freighter. If a freighter sees a patrol boat, they dump the load and go.
The more I'm talking to you, Nick, is that you guys were doing joint interagency multi-level governmental operations before there was a doctrine for it. I'm surprised I haven't seen this in a manual somewhere, at the very least in a memoir. But this is some amazing stuff.
Well, that's why I wrote the 2 books, but I carried them around with me for like 20 years going like, it's a tough story for me to tell. I'll be honest with you. It wasn't all fun and games.
Certainly not. I mean, this
was a very demanding situation, and family-wise, it was not easy to do. We spent weeks away from home sometime. When we were even off at a decent hour and had dinner at home at 8 o'clock at night, the phones are ringing, your pagers are going on. The more informants you had, and we also had what we call sources of information, which was a little different than other agencies. We worked with a lot of legitimate citizens who worked in certain fields where we did not call them an informant, because an informant always had that kind of a identity of being like a bad guy who got caught and got flipped and became like a helper to save his or her bacon from having to go to the Crowbar Hotel. And we had people that worked in mariners, private airports, people that fixed planes, mechanics, airline pilots that were approached by people to do things that they shouldn't do. And they would come to us. And
so we're talking solid citizens here. They just want to do the right thing.
Exactly. And the drug war was going on. So it was full blown back then that they felt a part of it. And I had quite a network. In fact, I got so busy that there were times when the command duty officer at air operations, this is before I became a special agent, he would cut me loose and say, yeah, go out and work in the field. And well, one of the pilots was a great the guy could break into anything. So we would get a warrant to break into a hangar, and or we managed to get into hangars certain ways, and there'd be an aircraft that was being configured for smuggling, and we put a tracker in it. Or I'd get a phone call and go meet somebody at a burger joint and say, there's a plane over there with a fuel system in it called a ferry system, but it's not being used the way the FAA wants a ferry system to be used, which was you got one shot. They get a 337 form. You're allowed to put extra fuel tanks in your aircraft. I buy this plane. I want to fly it Timbuktu across the United States. I don't want to land 20 times. Okay, you put the fuel system in and you go. But when you get where your destination is, it's got to come out. Well, the smugglers weren't taking them out.
And
Because they
there's
wanted to
probably
use
no
it.
mechanism to check on that anyway. This sounds like an honor system thing.
Yeah, exactly. And the good people would take it out because they were in the business of selling planes or buying planes, or a person bought it themselves, and they would have it taken out. They'd pay to do it. But the nefarious types would use it because it extended their range.
Makes sense.
And they could put a load, and then you had to worry about how much fuel you had on board versus how much load you could carry. But they worked all that out. So there were times, you know, I'd walk up to a pilot who was getting in an aircraft going, "Hi, can I see your 337 form?" But I knew where this person flew. I knew where they went. And then I just put a seizure sticker on the plane. I'm seizing your aircraft. And if you want to come and fight the seizure, you're welcome to do so. And of course, they never showed up.
Because they had no legal reason to be doing what they were doing, right? So.
No. And when I first became a special agent, one of the first CIs I had was a smuggler who never got caught, admitted it, basically turned himself in, going like, "I'm just tired of waiting to get arrested." And we basically made him one of our CIs. And one day he says to me, he was Cuban American, did some work for one of our agencies at a time when they were working in Cuba, and colorful character. And he said, "Listen, two gringos are going to show up in Calle Ocho section of Miami, 8th Street, and they're going to have 500,000 in cash. They're here to buy cocaine. They're going to be driving a car with Wyoming license plates." I'm going like, okay, I don't believe this guy. This is talking about specific information. All right. So I don't have a partner. So I go to Miami PD. I get their narcotics unit, a bunch of young detectives, hot, full of piss and vinegar. And we work a Friday and a Saturday. And sure enough, a car shows up with like Wyoming license plates in this little Havana section of Miami. We follow it and take it different places. And as we're going north on I-95 and we're leaving Dade County and going into Broward County, the lieutenant said to me, "Nick, we have no authority up here." I said, "That's not a problem. I'll deputize you guys over the radio." So I deputized the entire narcotics unit that was with us. I said, "You're all customs officers. Raise your right hand or just tell me you did so." And when we got to Fort Lauderdale, called a canine. Broward County Sheriff's Office came with the dog. And he alerted on the trunk. We took the bag out, went and wrote a search warrant, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, woke up a judge. He signed it. We opened up the bag and there was 530,000 in cash in there. The two bad guys got on a plane, went back to California and never contested the seizure.
Oh my goodness.
And then we split the money with Miami PD because it was an asset. So we seized half of it for Uncle Sam and the other half was asset shared to Miami.
So you've touched on like 4 things in that one anecdote that I want to unpack. So the first one being, and this is just Ben's curiosity now. All right, so I understand you have the authority to deputize other law enforcement agents into the Customs Service for the purpose of this operation. Got it. Would you have to follow up on that later? Like, was there paperwork involved after the arrest? Like, okay, these guys had the authority to do it because I deputized them, and then can you just Dominus Omus, you're deputized?
At that point, when you're operational, there's no, we're driving cars heading north. I just got on the radio and said, "You guys are with me. It's covered."
But you never have to follow that up later.
No, I think when they handed the creds out and they were more formal with like the sheriff's department and the police department and things became, I don't know if I'm not familiar with the process, but I heard later on that there was a lot of sets of creds floating around that nobody ever turned back in again. I guess they kept them as keepsakes.
Now, could you deputize anyone if you needed to?
Somebody gave me a card once that said that we could basically request anyone to assist us, but I would never do that. I limited it to just the LEOs that we were working with. That was the only time I was asked, by the way. Everybody else that we worked with was already commissioned.
Gotcha.
At that early stage, I don't know if those Miami detectives had. Obviously, they didn't have commission books because they asked me. They said, "We don't have authority up here."
Gotcha.
So I had to do it. I covered them.
Well, and it makes sense that you wouldn't deputize somebody who didn't have the skill set to help you do what you were trying to accomplish anyway.
Yeah, I
You
wouldn't
just,
ask them.
yeah,
It's too
you put yourself
dangerous.
in danger, you put them in danger.
Right.
But just as an academic point, I'm just fascinated by the fact that if you needed to, you could deputize anyone you needed to. That blows my mind.
Well, the other side of the coin too is that, like our contract pilots and our contract personnel, I mean, we were responsible for them. We, this wasn't basically like if something happened, they were on their own. Everything that they did, we documented.
Certainly.
So they were covered. Nobody could ever walk up to them. If somebody walked up to them later on, some agency, and said, you did X, Y, and Z, they would just point to Nick or to Pat or whichever agent I'm working with and said, no, we're working with those guys. Everything was fine. But if they walked up to them and said, we saw you at such and such a place meeting with so-and-so, and I didn't know about it, or my partner didn't know about it, then they were in trouble.
Gotcha.
They had to answer for themselves. So they were covered as an asset when they were doing the right thing.
Gotcha. No freelancing or
No, not tolerated.
makes perfect sense. The next point I want to bring up when you were talking about the fellow who gave you the intelligence you needed for this particular arrest or seizure, excuse me, and just the fact that the psychological toll over time. He had been very successful, like you said, never caught, but he turned himself in because he was waiting for the inevitable. I
Yeah.
imagine that you probably saw that on both sides of the table, not only with the folks who were doing nefarious activity, but I imagine the psychological toll on your fellow agents and the different people you operated with. Was there a high turnover rate you guys were dealing with?
When you latched on to a good source of information or a good informant, you had a relationship that you tried to work for a very, very, very long time. Were there instances when somebody did one case? Yeah, I'm sure it happened. But the people that I worked with became a core group of about a dozen of us. And I had agents from other parts of the country that would come in for aspects of what we were working on. And they would sit there and they would say things to me like, you only have a crew of 3 or 4. Why are there 9 other guys here? And I'd say, because when they have to go, these other guys show up for them. And it got to the point where everybody felt like that's why we were called the Blade Runner Squadron, because we flew on the edge. I had this thing with the knife and the plane taking off. It was like, whatever, that's our logo. And it became a thing where there were people who identified themselves with being a member of the Blade Runner Squadron before they identified themselves with being a customs agent. Like once you got brought into the Blade Runner Squadron, it was almost like an honor of sorts, because we were very closely knit and did some amazing stuff, and people's lives were definitely at risk. I mean, as you'll find out in the future broadcast, we had close calls. And on more than one occasion. And from your own experience, when you have close calls with people that could cost somebody their life, that bond becomes tighter and tighter and tighter.
Yes, sir. Totally understand. And that's a great setup, because now you kind of given us this background, and you've talked about how when you get an asset from seizure, you can actually use that to fund future operations. So we're at a point now where you've got these experiences, you've been operating in Florida, you've basically have a methodology to fund your operations, to expand them. You've got these experiences, you've got this core group of folks. This is about the time where everything's coming together, to steal a cliche, the perfect storm of resources, assets, opportunity. This is where control delivery really becomes a concept, correct?
Yes, control delivery existed as I said, it's a type of an undercover operation where you control contraband, you make the delivery, which is controlled, everything is controlled. And once you execute it, whoever says it's mine is under arrest. And if people are identified along the way who don't show up for the actual delivery, then you just go after them and make your arrests, because you've already identified them involved in the smuggling act.
Was this I'll call it a tactic for lack of a better term, or this tactic or these operations, did these grow organically over time, or did you have an aha moment where you went to your boss and said, "Hey, I want to operate a certain way using this tactic"?
It's a great question. Uh, when I was an agent, I was still flying occasionally. And one real quick story is one night I couldn't sleep, so I drove 50 miles to do some paperwork at Olmsted Air Force Base, and the alarm goes off for a scramble. So I leave the office to see a buddy of mine, and he was a Black Hawk pilot. And I said, "Are you short in the back?" He said, "Yeah, come on, we could use some help." So I grabbed my gear, got in the back of the Black Hawk. We take off. Make a long story short, we end up seeing a big fireball at night. Two jets are chasing this plane. They go to land, they ditch, they blow up. The aircraft blows up. We're ready to turn around and go home because there's no way anybody survived this fireball. Coast Guard gets on the radio and says, "Hey, could you go search for survivors?" Survivors? Look at the mushroom cloud. Well, we go anyway. So I'm in the starboard side door gunner's window on a Black Hawk. I'm hanging out, and lo and behold, I see the guy that I identified as the kicker, who would toss the load out, and a pilot wearing pilot's uniform with epaulets being carried to the beach. And there's a bunch of Bahamian go-fast boats all over the place like sharks. So I tell her, I'm sitting behind the PIC, and I said, "Hey, guess what? We got company down below." And lo and behold, this is like a 2-hour thing. We're circling on the radio. Somebody needs to rescue this guy. So they launch a Coast Guard helicopter from Opelika. And at some point, the Coast Guard says, "Hey, can we get an armed U.S. agent to escort our unarmed rescue party, our paramedic and our crew chief?" So like an idiot, I volunteer. And I go, "Yeah, I always wanted to work foreign. Let's go." So they land the Black Hawk and they drop me off. And like an idiot, I left my car 15 in the aircraft. I just had 2 handguns on me. And when they make a B-52 approach, they finally land, and I get in the chopper and they take off. And now when we get to the beach, all the Bahamians their go-fast boats are there, and they want to lower me down. And I see the pilot that was injured screaming. He's burnt. Guy's in bad shape. So I said, "No, I'm not doing this." And I guess the pilot in command didn't expect somebody to tell him no. I said, "This isn't going to work." I said, "I'm not going to get lowered down to it. These guys are like suspected smugglers. What are you, crazy?" So we went back and he said, "How can we do this?" I go, "Look, let's walk them. I'll walk your guys down to the beach." So as a female paramedic and a male crew chief, walk them down to the beach. The female paramedic grabs the badly burned, quote, suspected drug smuggling pilot. And the bad guys were trying to pick the marijuana or whatever he was carrying out of his. It wasn't burning. There's fire going on.
Oh my gosh.
And they walk the guy back to the helicopter, and the crew chief starts walking down the beach because all of a sudden we were told on the radio there's no Bahamian police there. And now a guy shows up wearing his kind of a dirty blue uniform, carrying a shotgun and a rifle. And he tells me that the other guy is down the beach. And I'm going like, this doesn't make any sense. Why would anybody who's injured in a plane crash that blew up be like taken off? But maybe he was pretty healthy. So we start walking down the beach, and the crew chief says, he goes, "What's your name, Agent?" I said, "Nick." He says, "Okay." He goes, I don't want to leave her alone." He goes, "Can I go back and help the paramedic?" I said, "Don't leave without me."
Fair.
The first words on my, I said, "Do not leave without me." He said, No, don't worry about it." I said, "I'll go down the beach looking for this other guy, but don't leave." Okay. Going down the beach, and the Bahamian cop says to me, "He's in there." I said, "Well, if you know he's in there, why don't you go get him? This is your island, not mine." So next thing I know, I hear this loud shrill over my head of that unique Delphine helicopter. They're flying that French Delphine. And I hear that whine, and I look up and I see that helicopter, that Coast Guard, but it's not stopping. And they take off and leave me behind. Now I'm in Bimini, armed, nobody else around me. And I see this dark kind of like vegetation, like jungle kind. I said, "I'm not going in there. What do you think? I'm nuts?" I said, "I'm out of here." I said, "Where are you going to go?" I says, "I'm out of here." So I leave. By the time I get back to the beach where the aircraft had crashed, all the Bahamian smugglers had beached their boats. Now they're in a semicircle. Now they think it's funny that Mr. Customs Man, because they had British accents on the Bahamas, was left behind. So now I'm in a real pickle. I'm going, how am I going to get out of this? And finally, and I see the Bahamian cop with the 2 weapons and another guy that said he was a cop. They're in the back. You could just tell if this was New York City, the cops would have been with me. If this was Timbuktu, the cops would have been with me. But these guys are pushed way back behind the crowd. So the crowd's obviously in charge, in my opinion. So this big guy with the Mr. T set gold chains around his neck walks up to me and says, "Where are you going to go, Mom? This is an island." So at the time, all I had was a 9mm pistol in my hand. I says, "I'm going to make a phone call." And I backed into the vegetation and took off. And I just found a place to hide, going like, I do not know how this is going to end. Well, the Black Hawk crew that was left me there, dropped me off to help the Coast Guard, called the Coast Guard, because our helicopters could not land on the roof of Jackson Memorial Hospital where the burn unit was, because the Black Hawk's too big. Coast Guard helicopters were small enough to do that. So the Coast Guard crew says, "Oh, we left him behind." And they exchanged words over the radio, and the Black Hawk crew turned around because they called the Coast Guard to say, "Hey, we're going to send a car up to Jackson Memorial to pick up our agent because we can't land there." And they went like, "What? No, he's not with us. We left him on the island." So they turned around, low on fuel actually, came back, and I hear the helicopter. Radio doesn't work. There's no repeater there. And I had a Navy issued flashlight with me. And as soon as I see the helicopter, I was in kind of surrounded in some vegetation. I started to signal them. And one of the guys had moved into where I was sitting in the starboard side door on his window. And he spotted me. But they couldn't land. Vegetation was too high. So the crew, and this is from working together with everybody. You know, this wasn't my first rodeo over there, as we had done stuff before. The crew took the Black Hawk and found a clearing and circled. And that was my signal that that's where I had to go. So I just kept my pistol in the ready pistol position. And I said, I was like fire. I was lit like you lit a fuse. I'm getting on that bird and I'm getting out of here. And when I broke through the clearing, they came in. The pilot was a FAC pilot in Vietnam. When that Black Hawk came in, he hit that ground so hard the tires compressed. And they opened the cargo door, and I literally dove in like it was a pool of cool water. And I wasn't even on the deck inside the bird when he just pulled pitch and put that nose down and cranked that, got out of there. So now I get back to Miami. I walk in, and the command duty officer hands me the phone and says, "The branch chief wants to talk to you." I'm going, "Oh." So I get on the phone. I say, "Yes, sir. How you doing?" He goes, "Nick, I only have one question for you." I said, "What's that, sir?" "Who gave you permission to get out of a U.S. Customs Service Black Hawk armed on Bahamian soil?" I said, "Sir, you know, I don't really recall the moment." And I put the phone down and walked away and went over to the crew and goes, "Nick, what, are we in trouble now for trying to rescue this guy?" I mean, they asked us for help, and it went away. But what was interesting, and this leads back into your question, I had worked a case where we seized an exotic car dealership right before this incident. So the next morning, I go see the special agent in charge because I wanted to start our operation, the Blade Runner Squad.
Okay.
So he's happy that we just seized 29 exotic cars, Mercedes, Ferrari, Lamborghinis, all this stuff, a Citation jet, a boat. It was a big case with the Broward County Sheriff's Department, with DEA, with the IRS. It was a joint operation that we ran for quite some time. And actually, I started my end of it by driving home one night about midnight, and I see this place, and I go, "I'm going to seize this joint one day. This can't be legit." And it turned out that I had one of my assets, and I were talking about other ways to make cases for customs. And I said, "You know, bad guys buy legitimate businesses and they launder their money in." And he goes, "Oh, yeah." He goes, "I know some people that did that. Go to that car dealership."
There it is.
Just the way things go over dinner. So the SAC was very happy. So I knocked on his door and said, "Can I see you for a minute?" And he was just on the phone with the sheriff, Nick Navarro, up in Broward County at the time. And I walk in and he goes, "What do you want to do?" Well, I had asked one of my contract pilots, who was a source of information, for a set of blueprints that he had on his desk. And they looked impressive as hell, but really had nothing to do with what we wanted to do. But I put the blueprints down and I said, "Sir, I'd like to start this operation where we can infiltrate smuggling organizations for the purposes of executing controlled delivery. And the first question he said to me, he's looking at the blueprints, like they had something to do with it. And I said, well, we're going to use all my sources, their facilities. They're going to be the undercover operation that we're going to base it out of. We got crews. I got contract pilots we're going to hire. I got mechanics who can fix our own planes. We're ready to go. He goes, what are you going to use for money? I said, well, the bad guys are going to pay us. If they want us to fly a load for them, they're going to have to give us transportation fee. And we'll go down and pick up the load. We'll get country clearance where we had to apply through Uncle Sam, and they would bless it under certain circumstances. He said, approved, done. Let's go see the regional commissioner. Go up there, lay the same blueprints out again. And everybody's looking at the blueprints, and I just pitched the deal, and they went like, you got it. So I walk out of the SAC office, Special Agent in Charge office. I'm like a GS like 12 nobody. And I'm standing there saying to myself, I just got put in command of my own like undercover Air Force. I have nobody to work with. I have no money. I have my own little band of private contractors to help me out. But let's do it. I went home and told my wife, and she was not happy.
I can imagine.
She was not happy. And that was the segue that started it off. And the first mission that we flew, it was, I mean, I always believed in divine intervention. I've always believed that. As crazy as it may sound, I'm not, I'm more spiritual, I think, than I am religious in the sense of I went to Catholic school. I majored in guilt like everybody else of my generation. And, but I always believed that you're here for a reason. And I always believe that God puts up these road signs. You can either look at the road sign and take the right when he says make a right, or you can go, nah, I'm not making the right, and go your own way and end up having to make a right down the road.
Exactly.
And that's just the way I believed. So I knew it was going to work. It was a question of we need a mission. And we got our first mission in Boston, Massachusetts.
Well, there we go. And I can't wait to talk about that mission, but I think that's going to have to wait for next time, folks.
No problem.
So Nick, what a fantastic opening. I'm really excited about this little mini series we're working on. The stories, this episode is a standalone, is just amazing. I've learned a lot. I hope the listeners learned a lot. It's been really excited to have you on here. We'll have you back in a couple of weeks, and we'll talk about that first mission in Boston.
Looking forward to it, Ben.
All right. So, hey, everybody, it's been Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest today has been Mr. Nick Jacobellis, and custom agent extraordinaire, and he'll be back with us soon to talk more about the Blade Runner operations. Nick, thanks again for coming out today.
Thank you, Ben. Take care. Bye-bye. Adios.